Here on The Jewish World, we discuss the weekly events and incidents from across the diaspora. But now we want to pause and ask, what constitutes the Jewish world? What does it even mean to be Jewish? There are so many different streams and definitions. Does this vary from country to country? Well, this past week, the Shechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem held an event in collaboration with the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York to address some of these questions. The event was titled, "To be a Jew in Israel and North America, Commonalities and Differences," and included Jewish leaders, academics, and journalists. And here to shed light on the conclusions of the conference and to answer some of these pressing questions is Rabbi Professor David Golinkin, president of the Shechter Institutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So let's jump right to the heart of the matter. What does it mean to be a Jew today in Israel and in the diaspora?
Well, that was really the subject of the conference. We talked about the different challenges facing the Jews of Israel and the diaspora. Obviously, in the diaspora, one of the biggest challenges is Jewish identity and intermarriage. It's very hard to maintain your Jewish identity in the diaspora today, given all of the pressures of modern society and modern media. Where in Israel, usually we're much more concerned with day-to-day issues such as survival and our conflict with some of our Arab neighbors. So the realities of the two situations are very different. Here, it's sort of taken for granted that you observe Jewish holidays because they're part of the national fabric. In the United States, you obviously have to make a big effort to observe Shabbat and the Jewish holidays. So the realities are very, very different, and we talked about what is the difference between being a Jew in Israel and being a Jew in the diaspora.
Okay, and before we go on, can you tell us a little bit about the Shechter Institute and the work that you do there?
Sure. The Schefter Institute has 4 arms. We run programs for 85,000 people every year. We run the graduate school, which is aimed at Israeli teachers, principals, and communal workers who do a master's degree in Jewish studies. The Shechter Rabbinical Seminary, which trains rabbis for the Masorti movement in Israel and throughout the world. The Tawi school system, which provides enriched Jewish studies to some 63,000 children in the Israeli public school system. And our branch in Tel Aviv, which is called Neve Shechter, which is an outreach center in Tel Aviv with an emphasis on Jewish music and Jewish art. And finally, vis-a-vis the diaspora, we run an entire Jewish school and synagogue system in Ukraine for the past 27 years, which is called Midreshet Yerushalayim. So these are some of the activities that Shechter does both in Israel and the diaspora in terms of Jewish education and Jewish identity.
Okay, so let's get back to the question at hand. One of the panels at the event discussed evolving Jewish identities in Israel and the United States. You touched upon this briefly, but can you share with us some insight into this from the panel and from your own personal experience?
Right. Well, for example, the panelists included Shmuel Rosner, who just published a best-selling book with Camille Fuchs about Yahadut Yisraelit, about Israeli Judaism, based on a survey of 3,000 people. Which showed what are the aspects of Jewish identity in Israel today. For example, some 67% of people make Kiddush on Friday night or have some sort of a Shabbat meal.
In Israel.
In Israel. And on Hanukkah, 75% light candles every night. And of course, 95% have a Passover Seder. In other words, in many ways, Jewish practices are an integral part of life in Israel, even if you don't define yourself as Jewish. On the other hand, in the diaspora, as I said, there's a huge problem of assimilation and intermarriage, and some half of the Jews in the United States are not affiliated formally with any synagogue or any Jewish religious institution. So we were talking about the differences in Jewish identity here and there. Professor Eisen, who came in specially from JTS in New York to participate in the conference, the chancellor of JTS in New York, he stressed the fact that many American Jews view Judaism as a religion and not as a nationality, which obviously causes a lot of them to distance themselves from Israel today. And he stressed the fact that if we want people to have a connection to Israel, they first of all need a connection to Judaism. Being a Zionist and loving the state of Israel is part of your Jewish identity. If you don't receive a Jewish education, you're obviously not going to have a strong identity vis-a-vis the state of Israel or Zionism. So he put an emphasis also in his Jerusalem Post interview on the fact that the Jews of the diaspora need to receive a really good Jewish education. And as part of that Jewish education, it will also increase their identity with the state of Israel and improve connections between Israel and the diaspora.
Yeah, so building on what you just said, another one of the panels at the event was also called, I think, Defending and Strengthening the Vital Religious Center in the United States and Israel. And this, of course, is a crucial issue today, as we're seeing, as you said, the number of people identifying as Jewish in the U.S. is in decline. So what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, lots of times, in the media, we give a lot of attention to the ktsavot, to the extremes, whether it's the Kahanists in Israel versus the extreme secularists, or in the diaspora, whether it's the people who want to disconnect from the state of Israel versus the Hasidim who live in Williamsburg. But most of the people in both communities are actually in the middle. And the best way to strengthen the connection between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews is to strengthen the middle. In other words, that the middle should more dictate what goes on and the discussion rather than the extremes. And it was my contention, based on sources both from rabbinical literature and medieval Jewish literature, that the middle way in Judaism has been considered an ideal from the Talmud to Maimonides until today, and that we need to strengthen the middle. And if we strengthen the middle, we will have more common ground between the Jews of Israel and the Jews of the diaspora. So that was the focus of the first session. And the focus of the third session was on Jewish identities in various types of Jewish literature, whether Yiddish literature presented by Professor David Roskies, the Jewish identity of Philip Roth as a typical American Jew of his generation, presented by Professor Michael Kramer, Bar-Ilan University, and Yochi Brandes, a well-known Israeli novelist who's also a graduate of the Shechter Institute, who talks about her own personal autobiography and what the Hebrew literature that she writes means to her as an Israeli, as a Jew. So using these three prisms of Yiddish, English, and Hebrew literature, we had a fascinating discussion about Jewish identity today as it's represented in three different types of Jewish literature from the past 100 years.
Okay, and I want to go back to the point you said about sort of focusing on the middle ground. How do you suggest that we do that in order to sort of repair this growing rift that we see between Israel and the diaspora?
Well, I think there are a number of ways of improving the connection. Everybody knows about birthright. 650,000 young people have been coming to Israel for the past 20 years or so. We also need reverse birthright. One of the things we started doing at Shechter this year was we started sending Tali teachers and principals to the United States for a 10-day intensive trip in which they learn about Jewish institutions, synagogues, JCCs, schools in the diaspora. In other words, Israelis need to learn about diaspora Jewry, just as diaspora Jewry learns about Israeli Jewry. Similarly, we have to stress the texts that are in the middle. Rather than teaching texts which cause a division, we have to teach Jewish studies and Jewish texts which talk about the importance of Jewish unity. Whether it's the Talmudic phrase, Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Bazeh, all Jews are responsible for one another, or whether it's the famous passage from the Tractate of Brachot, which I quoted in the conference. It says that the God puts on tefillin every morning. And what does it say in God's tefillin? It says, Umi ke'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like your people Israel, one united nation in the land? In other words, this is a text from 1800 years ago, which talks about God's ideal is that the Jewish people should be united. So by learning sources and by learning texts which stress Jewish unity and the commonality between Israel and the diaspora, we can help improve the relations between Israel and the diaspora. We should emphasize what holds us together rather than what keeps us apart.
Well, great. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Professor Rabbi David Golinkin. Thank you.
Rabbi.